Hi, I'm Alistair. I'm a games designer, and this is part of a series of videos in which I describe how I created a room escape game for International Games Week. Now, in the last video, I looked at how the theme and narrative and the overall parameters and constraints of the game were sort of designed. In this video, I'm going to be looking at some of the individual puzzles that I created. So the two themes for the escape room were going to be books and games. And with those in mind, I literally just set about trying to think of as many different ideas for props that I could use as the basis for puzzles based on those two themes. So starting with books, for example. Now, there's a very rich history of books being used to convey secret information by referencing words and page numbers, and you'll sort of see that used in classic spy movies and things like that. But there's lots of other ways that you can use books to send secret messages as well. So I thought about a puzzle using the ISBN number on the back, for example, or the barcode. I even tried sort of printing out this big barcode of one of the books. And there's an electronic scanner in the library itself. And I thought, well, if you tried to borrow a certain book, it would recognise the barcode, and maybe we could modify the lending machine to display a message and things like that. But I didn't want to risk messing up their system. Remember that this was a game that was taking place in a regular public library on a normal day, and that was one of the constraints we established in the last video, was that actually things had to sort of carry on as normal around the game. So I sort of quickly ruled that out of the question. I also thought about maybe using a handheld barcode scanner that the players would have access to scan the barcode, and maybe that would give a message. But I didn't have one of those to hand, and I wasn't sure whether it would take a lot of effort to make that work and whether I could justify that effort for the puzzle. So again, that got ruled out quite quickly. And I think the point is that you shouldn't be afraid to kind of have ideas and throw them away. Don't get too attached to ideas too early, because they just might not be feasible. And even if you think it will play out brilliantly in your head, it might just not be worth the effort. Now, by chance, as it happened, I was then reading the internet and I came across an article on blackout poetry. Now, this is something I hadn't heard of before. But what it is, it's a technique where you cross out words or passages from an existing newspaper article or story, and the words that get left behind, the handful of words that are still uncrossed out, take on a different meaning than the original text. So I decided to use that as the basis for a puzzle using a very similar technique. So this is a piece of acetate, and when lined up on the correct page of the correct book, these boxes reveal a code. So the problem with that is, obviously, we're in a library. There are literally hundreds of thousands of books around us. How do the players know which book to use for the acetate? And that was then a good opportunity to tie back into the narrative, I felt. So remember, the story is that the librarian has gone missing and that the players are trying to uncover what's happened to him. So with that in mind, it seems sensible that one of the first things they might look for is whether there's been any CCTV footage of the librarian's last whereabouts. We're in a public building, there is CCTV cameras available. So using my mad Photoshop skills, I created this fake CCTV camera footage showing the librarian returning some books. And I made sure that the titles of the books were clearly visible in the image. One of those books is the book in which this acetate lines up. It's actually the first page of the first chapter of Catcher in the Rye, as it happens. And that's denoted by the Roman numerals at the top and bottom. That was chapter 1, page 1. So once the players had found the book, they found this pretty easily. And I liked that puzzle for two reasons. One of which is that it uses the theme, obviously, in that it's based on a book prop. Another one is that it used the narrative as well, because the CCTV image was there because the players were ostensibly looking for the last known whereabouts of the librarian. And the other is it combines two different puzzle mechanics. The first one is finding the book that had been returned from the librarian, and that's a kind of a simple search and discovery type puzzle, which is very common in escape rooms. And the second one is a kind of manipulation puzzle, because you had to combine this item with the book as well. So it's a combination of two items. It had sort of all the elements in it. It had the theme and the narrative tied together, and it also had two types of puzzle mechanics: the finding the book and then the combining with another item. So what about the other books on that CCTV image that the librarian returned? Well, another property of books is that it's very easy to conceal small flat items between them, such as, for example, playing cards. So one of the other books that the librarian returned had tucked inside the inside cover 4 playing cards like that, and that was put on the shelf. And those 4 playing cards, there was one of each suit, each with a different denomination value. Placed elsewhere on the walls of the library was this series of images. So that denotes the order of the suits that the player had to arrange the card in. So we have an image of a heart, diamonds, a spade and a club. And when players realised that, that gave them the order in which they had to arrange the card value. So that's another example of a puzzle that combined an original search, which was to find the cards in the book, and then a combination with another object, which was, and in fact it involved discovery of the image as well in the library that gave them the suits, and then combining those two. The third book that the librarian had returned, I didn't want to reuse the same mechanic again. I'd already done 2 now where the players found a book, combined it with another item. So I thought I'd actually make a little bit of a joke on the players with that one. In that contained in the pages of the third book was this. This is, of course, a red herring. And this is another... So there's sort of 2 points that this demonstrates. The first one, I guess, is that don't reuse the same idea too many times in a room. Try to get different sorts of puzzle elements. And the third is to remember the objectives of your game. In my case, I wanted the game to be enjoyable, and that was kind of a cheap laugh at the players' expenses, I guess, is that, you think you've worked out the puzzles now, there's something in all the books, and actually this one there wasn't. So that gives you some idea of how I went about designing some of the puzzles to do with books. I also wanted to bring in the other theme of the game as well, and that was about games itself. This was an escape room game as part of International Games Week, and that involves all sorts of games: board games, card games, social games. Now, I'm a keen games player myself, so I've got quite a lot of games. But remember the constraints and parameters that we discussed in video 1 is that I wanted to make sure that these were things familiar to my audience, or that they would at least have a common understanding of. So I wanted to stick to fairly well-known, popular games as props for this. So I considered chess, card games, dice games, and classic board games like Cluedo or Monopoly or Risk and things like that. So again, as with the books, I had quite a few ideas that didn't make the final cut. I wanted to do something with battleships, for example, because it has this obvious grid system, and I thought, well, maybe there's a way I could indicate a code through the placement of ships. But I only had this kind of fairly cheap travel edition, and the pegs kept falling out, and so that just didn't work in the end. I also wanted to do a puzzle on a board game set on a world map, like Risk, for example. So the idea here was that I wanted players to perhaps plot different locations on the map, and then maybe joining them together would spell out a code or something like that. The problem is that largely ended up being more of a geography quiz than a fun game to play, and it took a long time, and players kind of worked out what they had to do quite quickly, but then the actual finding all the places turned into a bit boring, so that got dropped as well. Again, as with the books, I encourage you, don't be afraid to drop ideas and move on if they're just not working out the way you thought they were going to. Then I got this copy of Guess Who from a charity shop. This cost me £1.50. And charity shops are brilliant sources of props. I really encourage you to go and look there for when you're next designing a puzzle. And this I thought was a really nice puzzle idea. I think it's something that most people are familiar with, certainly in this country. It's a game that a lot of people played as kids. And the idea is you obviously have to find the character that your opponent is thinking of by asking descriptive questions about the person on the card. So it's essentially a game of logical deduction, which would make it ideal for a puzzle solving game. So again, as with the books, what I wanted to do was tie the two themes of books and games together. This was my game. Now I needed some kind of literary element to work with it. So I kind of composed this really fairly awful love poem. And I gave it to the players sort of wrapped up in a scroll. And it's certainly no kind of Song of Solomon. But what I hoped that the players would realise in reading the poem is that the structure contained the answers to the most common questions asked in the game Guess Who. So that is it a man or a woman? Do they wear glasses? Do they have certain colour hair? What size are their lips? So in reading the poem and having the Guess Who board in front of them, I wanted players to work out that these two items went together. They then had to find out which character the poem was describing, who is the name of this person. And what I'd done, so the solution was Anne, this character here, and I made a false back of the card, and behind the false back was this small key hidden there with a false back behind it, and that unlocked a padlock. Now, I was also very keen to use Monopoly as one of the puzzles. I think Monopoly is possibly the most iconic board game that there is. And there's lots of easy ways you could think to give a code to the players using a Monopoly board. Every square has a colour, so there's a method of using colours perhaps to describe a code. Obviously also has a value, the rental cost associated with it. You use dice, so perhaps you could count a certain number of squares around the board. There's lots and lots of different ways I could use it, but I decided to keep this puzzle actually really simple and straightforward. I think that's another thing to bear in mind, is that you want to have a variety of puzzles in your game to appeal to different sorts of players. I've already mentioned about having the different mechanics like discovery and manipulation, and you can have assembly puzzles as well. So I didn't actually use a jigsaw puzzle in this particular game, but it's quite common to have jigsaw or other elements that you have to assemble, because that appeals to, again, a different sort of puzzle solving ability. But in this one I wanted to keep it really simple. So one of the squares on the board is the waterworks. Here it is. And the waterworks sells for £150 in this version of the game. So what I had was I simply had a card that had H2O and a pound symbol on it, which was, what is the cost of water, effectively, was the question. And players looked at the board and just read off the 150 value. So very straightforward, but I think it's important to have that range of deductive steps, some being very, very straightforward and some being slightly more involved, so that you can get players of different abilities getting involved in the game. The other nice thing about using this board, so this was actually sort of a centerpiece for the whole space in which the game was based, and because it has these nice spaces on the board where the community chest and the chance cards are normally placed, I actually placed puzzle boxes on those spaces instead. So the community chest was a very real chest. It had a padlock on it, and I also had another box on the chance square there. So it became a kind of a focal centerpiece, the whole board, and that's just another really nice way, I think, of tying in the different props together. So that's essentially how I approached creating a lot of the puzzles for the game, using common physical props that I either already had lying around or that I was able to pick up very cheaply from local charity shops. And essentially, whatever your theme is, you can find items that will fit into it that can be used as the basis of a puzzle. If it is anything that will allow information to be conveyed in perhaps a slightly hidden way, or information to be translated between different ways. So for example, a phone directory, in which case you look up a person and you get a number code that could be used in a number padlock, or items on a takeaway menu, or catalogues, or maps, or flags which encode colours into positions. It's just a matter of thinking creatively about props that are relevant to your theme and narrative, and that you can kind of work into an inventive step that the players have to take to get that information out of the prop. So it's quite unusual for puzzle designers to actually give away the exact puzzles they use. Obviously, if you are a player of escape rooms yourself, please don't go and describe the exact puzzles that were used in the games you have played, because that will spoil it for future players. And puzzle masters themselves typically don't reveal those details either. But because this was an experience that was a one-off and has been and gone, I feel quite sort of happy sharing the puzzles with you. And you're very welcome to go and copy these ideas yourself or adapt them if you want. But what I'd rather be able to pass on to you is really the process by which all of these puzzles were created. So I started off with the theme elements which I was considering for the game. So this was books and games. They were the two thematic elements I wanted to work into all the puzzles throughout this. And starting with that, I simply brainstormed all the different ways in which I could think that I could have a prop, an iconic prop that the players would be familiar with, fitting into one of those two themes, that could be used in some way to convey information to the player. And considered how much the players might need signposting in the use of those various props. I mean, everyone is familiar with books, clearly. Most people are familiar with board games, but I wanted to stick with popular games that would appeal to my target audience. Again, going back to the constraints and the parameters I considered in the first video. And as much as possible, not only try to incorporate the theme into your props, but incorporate the narrative as well. So the example with the acetate sheet and the CCTV being fed back to the disappearance of the librarian, for example. That's a nice way of incorporating both the theme and the narrative together. And don't hang on to bad ideas either. It's very easy to become fixated in your head on a particular idea that you think is going to be fantastic. But if it turns out being either too fiddly for the players to use, or too expensive to develop, or just too complicated to understand, don't be afraid to drop bad ideas and just come up with new ones and new ones. There's a lot of iteration, and I threw away a lot of ideas here which I haven't shown and I haven't used. Maybe I'll come back to them again in the future, but don't be afraid to drop and move on. All the puzzles I've shown you in this video were very straightforward, non-technical, non-mechanical. They were just sort of worked out of the box. In the next video, I'm going to show you how I created a few of the more high-tech puzzles that used elements of electronics or other technology to create a bit of sort of added magic behind some of the puzzles.